Welcome to this special program on Kairali channel. This is a panel conversation between Professor Noam Chomsky of University Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and two leading experts in the field of the mass media in India, N. Ram, who is editor of Frontline and also editor of Business Line and Sports Star, and Sashi Kumar, the chairman of the Media Development Foundation, which has established in Chennai the Asian College of Journalism. Noam Chomsky is perhaps the world's most renowned academic scholar. He is the founder of the modern science of linguistics. He is a social theorist, activist, a media critic, and author of many books, philosopher, and a great inspiration to people involved in anti-imperialist activism all over the world.
In your framework of analysis, manufacture of consent by the media is part of a continuum.
So what you do, in response to Ram's first question, what you're emphasizing is the continuity.
It's continuous. I mean, it's also true of the academic professions. Take, say, economics. You know, I mean, in economics, there's certain things you measure. There are other things you don't measure. They're called externalities. Well, if you look at the decisions, I mean, they have a strict ideological component. I mean, you measure things that are going to be useful for achieving the purposes of power. Externalities you don't count. So, I mean, take, say, the U.S. and Mexico. You measure what's called trade. If you want to estimate the, the wonders of the so-called free trade agreements, emphasis so-called because they're not free trade agreements. But if you look at them, you ask, well, how much has trade increased? How much has gross domestic product increased? And a few things you look at. If you look at those things, you get a pretty picture, and then you can have headlines and so on. But what you don't ask is what happened to hundreds of thousands of Mexican farmers who were driven off the land because they couldn't compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness, and that destroyed their communities and their lives and their support systems and drove them into urban slums and finally forced them into the United States where they get killed by border guards. I mean, you just don't count these things. Those are externalities.
May I just take you to second question, the one about different.
Can you apply? How do you
apply to
as a model builder? Can you apply?
Well, you
to
have to look.
Are there differences of degree?
Each society is itself. So if you apply it to the Soviet Union, it would look a little bit different. In fact, in the Soviet Union, it's not even worth applying it because the center of power was too obvious. So it's not even worth looking at.
I think but in India, about Europe. You were asking about Europe. And
UK and
European press.
And India also.
It's kind of a striking fact that almost all, first of all, you can't just, I mean, the model is almost a triviality. We don't even call it a theory. In fact, it's common sense, simple common sense. The bulk of the work, in fact, the whole book is concerned with working out the empirical details. What actually happens in crucial cases? And we took a whole
elections, coverage of
we took crucial cases, which would test how it works, and it's astonishing. I mean, it goes beyond what you'd predict, the level of conformity. Now, this detailed, intensive work has been almost entirely done in the United States. There's some in England, virtually none in continental Europe, and so you don't really have the empirical basis for drawing conclusions. Part of the reason it's not done in continental Europe is because the intellectuals there are much more conformist than in the United States. They believe that they're free and independent, and how could anybody ask any questions about us? Look how courageous and the tribunes of the people and so on. It's total nonsense. I mean, they're highly conformist and subservient, but so much so that they won't even study themselves.
But would it be correct to say this general impression that the European press has more space for the truth, for facts, for the left?
No, on the contrary. On the contrary. I mean, in fact, when you look at, let's take the French press. Take, say, something that concerns France, like France and Algeria, or for that matter, France in the Second World War. I mean, during the whole post-war period, the truth about France in the Second World War was suppressed. It was finally exposed by scholars in the United States, and then it sort of drifted into France. But they were shocked to discover what anybody who looked from the outside knew was true, that France was a collaborationist country. I mean, they were, including the French intellectuals, you know, almost all of them. I mean, there was a resistance, but it was a small resistance. It was, you know, courageous people, but it was by no means a country. Or take, say, France and Algeria. I mean, the atrocities that the French carried out in Algeria are only now beginning to be exposed because of, you know, generals in the army who say, yeah, I did this horrible thing. It gets worse. When France left Algeria, it left it the way Britain left Nigeria and so on. The idea was to maintain the colonial structure, but in a different framework. That's the way all the European countries decolonized. Let's try to maintain the structure, but with a different form. All right, in North Africa and Algeria, there was an independence movement. It gradually dissolved for various reasons. It ended up with a system in which French intelligence is closely integrated with the Algerian government, and they are carrying out murderous terror right now. This is not being, it's beginning to be exposed in France. I mean, Algerians have been exposing it for a long time. It's just, let me give you one example, which I was involved in, so I know about it. There are many, there's a lot of what's called Islamic terror in Algeria, and some of it actually is radical Islamic terror. But it's pretty clear that a lot of it, probably most of it's being carried out by the government under the guise of Islamic terror. Well, a few years ago, a group of Algerian expatriate scientists, physicists and others, tried to put together a study, careful study, of the atrocities in Algeria. I knew about this because one of them happens to be a colleague of mine in the physics department at MIT, so I learned about it from him. And followed, and they asked me to write the introduction to their book, so I wrote it. So there's a big book, which is a detailed, careful study done by quite competent scientists and historians, in which they simply study the massacres, case by case, and ask what happened. And a typical story is something like this. There's a slum area, always very poor areas, exactly the areas you'd expect the Islamic militants not to hit. You know, it's their base of support. So there's a slum area somewhere. People come in dressed in Islamic garb and so on, and they start murdering everybody. And it goes on for 10 hours. 5 kilometers away, there's a big military base, and nobody notices. You know, nobody comes over and does anything. And when the massacre's over and the people are dead, there's a big propaganda about Islamic massacre. 6 months later, some general buys the land and builds a hotel. You know? I mean, that's a typical massacre. And they give case after case like this big, thick book. I wrote the introduction. It was impossible to get it published in France. Oh, in the background is the fact, which I talked about in my introduction, that probably the Algerian state and French intelligence are manipulating this, and there's reasonable evidence for it. They couldn't get it published in France, so it got published in Switzerland. You couldn't get a copy into France. Finally, one copy of the book got into France through my efforts. I asked an American expatriate living in France to get the American Library in Paris to buy one copy. So, okay, one copy of the book got into France. They tried to have a press conference to open the book. It was suppressed. France does not, and they do not want to know about their ongoing atrocities. Now, it's not, I don't want to make it 100%, so like Le Monde Diplomatique is quite different. There are exceptions. But overwhelmingly, this is the way it works. And it's the same in every country. Everyone I've ever looked at. I mean, in Britain, there is a good media analysis group in Glasgow University, and they've exposed things done by the British press, which are astonishing.
No,
we have about 10 minutes left.
Can I ask a follow-up question on this? Sure. Just manufacturing consent, isn't it also the case that what has really happened since the Second World War, from from Truman to Clinton and Bush is the ascendancy of the American information system. And the US has consciously spent money and effort on that, something like $3 trillion to ensure the information ascendancy. So that the rest of the world is really caught into a mold of tailism, much of it. Even in cinema, for instance, Hollywoodization, you don't have French cinema.
Ben Bagdikane has an essay on it.
Any other
cinema.
In fact, well, I'm sure you remember, but back in the 1970s, the Third World tried to institute through the United Nations a new international information order.
McBride Commission reports.
Yeah, McBride Commission and others, they tried to work it through UNESCO. What they were calling for was an opening up of the international media, so there could be some level of participation from the South.
Yes.
Well, that led to total hysteria in the United States. There was a huge attack on it. There was a pretense that they were trying to stop freedom of the press, which was a total lie. Lie after lie was produced. It could never be refuted. The UNESCO people, McBride himself, they were not allowed to even publish a letter in the New York Times responding to it. Right. Finally, the United States virtually destroyed UNESCO in order to prevent a slight opening of the information system, which would have meant marginal participation by the South. If you look at resources, you can imagine how it would have come if it was opened up. But the idea that there might be some breakdown in the totalitarian control did lead to hysteria. There's a very good book about this called Hope and Folly. Ed Herman was one of the people. That book was published by a university press, major press. It has never been mentioned. It's never been reviewed. It's never been mentioned, exposing the whole thing. Yeah. And that reflects their understanding that you must maintain tight control over information. This morning's newspaper discusses how the U.S. and Britain are coordinating their propaganda efforts to enable them to compete with Taliban propaganda. I mean, if you think about this, you don't even know how to respond. But that expresses the quite proper fear of those who run the world, that if anything gets out of control, even the smallest thing, the whole system could unravel. So it may be Taliban propaganda we can't compete with.
Noam, you wrote a famous essay. I recently downloaded it on the net. Appeared in the New York Review of Books in, I believe, February 1967, The Responsibility of Intellectuals. And that was in the background of not only your opposition to the Vietnam War, but you were among the first American intellectuals. It's considered a watershed to oppose the war. And I remember one of the formulations, it's the responsibility of intellectuals to expose the lies of governments, etc. What is the responsibility of intellectuals, both American and intellectuals and intellectuals abroad, including Indian intellectuals, vis-a-vis the present international crisis about policy outcomes? What is their responsibility?
Well, it's pretty elementary. Tell the truth. Don't subordinate yourself to the power systems. Tell the truth, and tell it to the people who have to know. Like, there are friends of mine in the Quaker movement and others who have the slogan, "Tell truth to power." I've never agreed with them. You don't have to tell truth to power. They know all about it already. What you do is tell truth to the powerless. And don't tell truth to them, but listen to them. Be part of the powerless. Interact with the powerless. You use your capacity, your luck. If we're to be an intellectual is to be lucky. It's to be privileged. To be much too wealthy, more wealthy than we ought to be. To have training and access to resources. I mean, you can do things. You can do things that ordinary poor people can't do. So you should join them, participate with them, contribute what you have as a result of your own privilege, which you shouldn't have, but you do have, and be part of them. You don't tell them truth. You learn truth from them. You contribute what you can, and in this case, I mean, we should be working day and night to stop one of the major atrocities of modern times. A planned mass murder of several million people, that's not a small thing. And we should try to break the monopoly of control by the British and American and Western and, in fact, organized, not just media, but the propaganda system in general, and get people to understand it. That's what happened during the Vietnam War. There were very few intellectuals who opposed the Vietnam War, ever.
You went to jail.
Yeah, but there were few people, not much. In fact, the difference between the intellectuals and the population is quite dramatic. There's good studies of it. I mean, a tiny percentage of elite intellectuals at some point everyone opposed the war, like the business community opposed it. It was just costing too much. But if you look at the principled opposition, opposition because it's wrong, among intellectuals it's virtually non-existent. You cannot find a phrase, virtually, in the major journals or opinion or media or whatever, saying the war was wrong. The most you can find at the sort of left end is, Anthony Lewis of the New York Times. It began with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969 it was clear that it was costing us too much, so it was a mistake. That's the critical position. You take a look at the population. The United States is a very heavily, there are a lot of opinion studies, very intense. The Chicago Council of Foreign Relations does regular studies of people's attitudes on all sorts of topics. Since 1969, they have regularly published studies on this. And a lot of the questions are about the Vietnam War, of course. One of the questions is, what do you think about the Vietnam War? And people have a series of choices, an open question. You don't get high numbers on an open question usually, but on this you do. About 70% of the population from 1969 up until today says the Vietnam War was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Okay, that's 70% of the population, virtually none of the intellectuals. And those are remarkable numbers because they never hear it. Every person who answers that way made it up for themselves because they never read it and they never heard it. Intellectual opinion is, well, it's a benign effort that went wrong and it was a mistake, but not the population.
There's no time for questions on linguistics.
I'm afraid not.
Just on this point, there's like the Economist's cover which says,
heart-rending but necessary war.
Necessary. Just like Osama bin Laden. It's a legitimate terror. It's legitimate terror, unfortunate, but it's legitimate. That's the Economist. The Economist and bin Laden are identical, except for which terror you like. And the Economist is much more far-ranging, remember. They're going to drive the people they don't like out of the world.
Yes.
Bin Laden wants to drive them out of the Muslim world. Much more modest objective.
On the intellectuals, there's just one quick follow-on question, if I may. The problem of who the intellectual is, because television also manufactures quick-fix intellectuals now, and people like Derrida are warning us against intellectuals against the temptation of the media. Do you think there's a case for that?
I don't even use the word intellectuals. Right. I mean, intellectuals are, I've known people who I would call intellectuals who never went to school, who, were just became self-educated and know much more than professors I know at Harvard. It's a term that privileged people use to refer to themselves, and we should drop it. It's people who want to find out and understand the world.
With that, we must end, and I'm sure Ram, Shashi, both of you join me in thanking Noam for this wonderful conversation.
It's been a privilege talking to you.
Good talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We didn't